We want to act like we're going to be here forever. I wanted to be a psychotherapist. When you struggle with self-esteem, nothing really seems like it's worth the effort.
The best thing to do is to compare yourself to yourself.
The first of which is stigma. Stigma surrounding suicide, stigma surrounding overdose deaths. But at what point does anybody teach us about death? Who's going to come along and say, hey, we are all here for a limited time only? Comparing ourselves to others, being jealous of people, that's just like a recipe for unhappiness and bitterness.
Talk a little bit about prolonged grief disorder.
Labeled a slow learner.
I always felt a little bit
always felt
different.
like there was something wrong with me.
Embarrassed. Wasn't ready to see myself.
I can't go any lower.
Don't sell yourself short.
Uncovering all those feelings. Everything was lifted at that moment.
This really wasn't about not drinking.
Welcome to CrossTalk, a great place for you to learn how to live balanced, to learn how to stay sober or get sober. We interview really interesting people, and today is no exception. Before we start our interview today, I want you to remind you to subscribe, follow, like us, and ring that bell, and give us your comments. Tell us what you want to hear more of, and anything that you want to tell us, our ears are open. Just let us know what we can do, and we want to keep getting better and better and better. And by today's interview, we're getting better. So we have a great guest with us today from Boca, Florida. His practice is in East Boca, a therapist who's helped many, many people down in Florida and remotely all over the world. Welcome, Eric Bricker. Eric, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Corey, Irene, Sergio. It's great to be here.
Eric, just to start out, tell our viewers a little bit. You're not actually in recovery, so you're one of our guests who are here to inform. But tell us a little bit about how you grew up and how you got into becoming somebody who's working in a therapeutic environment.
So the first kind of inkling that I ever had that I wanted to be a psychotherapist, I was probably about 12 years old, and I saw the movie Ordinary People. Are you familiar with it?
Yeah.
It's a movie.
It's Mary Tyler Moore, right?
It is. It's Mary Tyler Moore, Donald Sutherland, Timothy Hutton, and Judd Hirsch plays the therapist. Mm-hmm. Judd Hirsch that everyone knows from Taxi.
Taxi, yeah.
So it was a really tragic movie where a family member dies, and the Timothy Hutton, who is like a teenager at that time, witnesses this tragedy. His brother's killed, and it really tears the family apart. And they were kind of dysfunctional beforehand, but it just exacerbated that. And these people all went on to really struggle a lot. So the young man, Timothy Hutton, enters therapy. He's psychiatrically hospitalized. He has suicide attempts. It's severe. And he enters therapy with the character played by Judd Hirsch. And what changed for me, what I experienced in watching that was the first time I can ever recall being aware that there was a therapist, like that there was some guy that people talk to about really personal and important things and difficult struggles that they're having that actually works with people. And I was fascinated by the idea. I remember something just kind of went off in my mind when I saw it. I was like, I wonder if I could get to do that, or how do you get to do that, or who are the people that do that job?
Right.
Because to me, up to that time, my reference to anything involving a psychiatrist was probably like the Sigmund Freud character on Bugs Bunny. The guy who was hypnotizing Elmer Fudd with a watch. So that was what I knew about psychiatry up to that point.
And my idea was somebody who would sound like, what does it mean?
Yeah.
He didn't speak in a English kind of a
well, that's what it was on Bugs Bunny. It was a caricature of Sigmund Freud, and he was like, hypnotizing Elmer Fudd.
Right.
Or hypnotized Bugs Bunny to think that he was Elmer Fudd.
Right. Now let's talk a little bit about Elmer Fudd. No, yes. I'm sorry. I got distracted. I get so easily distracted. So Ordinary People was an award-winning movie.
Yeah.
And the all-star cast. So everybody was impacted by that movie if you saw it. And if you haven't seen it, go see it. It's a great movie. So it got you into a position where when you went to school, that stuck in your mind, and you started taking courses along those lines when you got to college?
It was interesting because I was a classic underachiever as a high school student. I was a person who really struggled a lot with self-esteem. So when you struggle with self-esteem, nothing really seems like it's worth the effort. So you just don't try hard. And I was kind of more like a straight C student in high school. I didn't really consider myself a person who was competing for valedictorian or even honor roll for that matter. I didn't see that in myself. I didn't really see the potential in myself, although people around me told me I had it. So I kind of coasted. But even in high school, when there were opportunities to take classes in psychology, and they offered some basic ones, I always did. And that was always the ones where I would actually read the textbooks and have an interest, you know. And
Did you get good grades in those courses?
Better.
Yeah.
Better. I think I might have like elevated myself to actually read the textbook and strive for like a B+ or something.
Right. The school environment is very different than the environment you're in right now.
Very.
So now you're excelling in your practice.
I am.
You went to college and got different degrees?
I originally went to school and majored in marketing. And my dad, because I was very directionless, and my parents were worried about me. They're like, you're going to have to do something with your life at some point. And quite frankly, we both think you're, at this point, ill-equipped to be like an adult. So we need you to grow up. And my dad was like, look, you should major in marketing and go into sales, because I think that with your personality, you would tolerate rejection well. That was what my dad said to me. He's like, you would tolerate rejection well, so you should go into sales.
Reminds me of this scene in a Paper Chase where John Houseman hands a dime, a phone call in a public phone was a dime at the time they made the Paper Chase movie, and he hands a dime to the actor who played the student. Here's a dime. I want you to call your mother. Tell her there's very serious doubt as to you ever becoming a lawyer. That was the line.
That's amazing.
Right. That reminds me of what your mom and dad said. You'll tolerate rejection. What a great compliment.
Well, I mean, and the truth of the matter was, he was totally serious. He was totally serious. Like, you'll make a lot of money because you're not bothered by it, you know. But that was funny. And I did that for a while. I was a marketing major for like 3 years. And I think there was a moment of clarity at the end where it's the time of putting off adulthood. It's getting less and less, right? Like this protracted adolescence you get to experience by going to college. Like at some point it ends and you got to kind of go and face the world. And I knew I wasn't equipped. I didn't feel like I was equipped to go out and work and, you know, do any kind of a career. But yet this thing about being a therapist, it was still in the back of my mind. So really, in what would have been my senior year, I switched majors, which most people don't do. And it cost me to stay in school for really like an extra year to graduate with a degree in psychology. But I'm glad I did it. And my parents supported me in that. I think they understood that this is the first time he's ever been excited about anything career related or academic. And even though his ceiling is going to be a lot lower than if he had, you know, hit a home run as an insurance salesman or something, I think we got to get behind this.
Good. So, and after college, did you go on to get any other degrees or any other work?
Yeah, I actually went right into, there was a master's program at FAU, and I applied while I was in the undergraduate program. So I actually got to take a master's class as part of my undergraduate study. You'd never be able to do this now, but I was able to take it as an elective. And so I knew I was going to go into that program, but I did take a year afterwards to go work as a case manager for a mental health, like an outpatient mental health facility in Fort Lauderdale that served like indigent and homeless people with psychiatric disorders.
How was that experience?
It was very eye-opening because the goal, so this is following deinstitutionalization here in Florida, where there were a lot of these people who has historically been long-term psychiatric, like state hospital residents, and they were taking these people out of the state hospitals and they were putting them into community in these ACLF homes, adult congregate living facility homes, which is kind of like halfway houses and residences for people with mental illness, and others who were living independently on Section 8 housing and different things. So my role was to be in the community with these people and keep them connected to the facility so that they would stay on medications, because quite often they would relapse into psychosis. They would end up in crisis, psychiatric hospitalizations, Baker Acts, all those kinds of things.
And you dealt with these people one-on-one or in a group setting?
One-on-one in the community and then part of a team in the facility.
Okay.
Henderson Mental Health Center is the name of the place, and they're still active and really serving, I think, pretty much all of Broward County.
So that was for a year.
Yes.
What would you do after that?
I went back to school, and I wanted to take a job that would be part-time so I could move through school faster and I could be a full-time student. I don't think I would have been able to do it as a full-time work, and I think it just would have burned me out. I didn't have that kind of work ethic back then, man.
Right.
And so as a graduate student, right across the street from FAU was a program called National Recovery Institute. And it was a substance use disorder treatment center back in the early 90s. And a professor I had advised me that I should get some experience in drug counseling, because at that time I was kind of being mentored by this guy. His name was Dr. Alex Miranda. And he was a professor who had a lot of forensic experience. He did a lot of work in the prisons. So he actually worked for Georgia State Penitentiary. And his body of research was actually contributed to the database that the FBI's profiling department utilizes. So if you think about what was going on that time, Silence of the Lambs, all of this exposure of forensic psychology and criminal profiling, I wanted to be part of all of that. And he said at the master's level, if you get experienced drug counseling, a lot of these federal prisons have drug counseling programs within them. And so if you get credentials in that, you can start your career that way and then maybe work your way up to forensics. So that was the original plan. So I got this job working as a behavioral tech at a National Recovery Institute, and I got exposed to the mecca of recovery and this little world of sobriety that existed here in Delray and Boca and in Florida, and all of these different people that were coming from all over the country, to try to get sober here. And I got exposed to it, and I met all these like really interesting characters, all these, and I like stories. I like unique people. I see the world through the lens of stories and characters, and that's what I find most interesting.
Each person that ends up in recovery each person on the earth is unique. Each person's face and fingerprint is unique. But I find that people in recovery, because of what they've gone through, have particularly interesting stories.
Very.
It's like a Damon Runyon story, one after another after another.
That's the reference, Damon Runyon, like colorful characters. So, and that's the kind of stuff that I read, like Elmore Leonard and like Pulp, Pulp Fiction, really, like that, Elmore Leonard, the guy who, he was a beat writer for the Sun Sentinel here in South Florida, published 1 million books. So I'm entertained by stuff like that kind of Pulp Fiction, Carl Hyacin, Elmore Leonard, like those kind of writers. And so I love characters and I love personalities. And I just got hooked. I was just fascinated by these people, and I could listen to the stories, and there were stories of the people who were already recovering that worked there, and the quirky personalities and all the sayings and expressions and anecdotes. I was all in for all of it. And when you meet somebody from New York City who has been on methadone for 20 years and was part of like the original kind of Frank Lucas heroin epidemic in New York in the 60s and 70s, and the stories that they tell from that time and being on methadone and what's that like, and then they come to South Florida and they're trying to get off of this, and it's the struggle for life and death. And I just I just got taken in by the whole thing, really. And also, the other thing that I recognized about it was the outcomes, like where people could get to from being in these horrible positions and where they could elevate to in sobriety, the night and day. It really was miraculous. And wanting to be a part of those wins, those stories, those accomplishments and achievements, all of that overcoming, I got hooked into it.
Each one of those seems like a game 7 of a World Series, because to go from where some of these people started to be able to have a life, I mean, that's something to say that you had a part of.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah.
And I wanted to be involved. I wanted to be involved in whatever way I could. And, it served on an institutional level. And you have to learn certain things along the way, which is that those outcomes, unfortunately, are more the exception than the rule. Mm-hmm. And so with those amazing recovery stories, there's also a lot of tragedy and a lot of folks that just don't make it. And so you learn to balance both. But
so hold on a second. As a therapist, I want you to help me with something. Why is it that I remember the people along the way? I got sober in 1982. I had a little diversion about 10 years ago or so, but I remember the people who didn't make it far more than the people that I've been able to help. What's that about?
I think that negative experiences and traumatic experiences tend to be more potent in terms of their imprinting on the mind than positive ones. We love a happy story, but we remember in greater detail and more viscerally tragedies.
Mm-hmm. Like they never go away.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't, wake up and go to sleep thinking about it. But when I think back over the arc of my life and recovery, the people that didn't make it are the people that, I kind of kick myself. Maybe I could have done more.
Lost potential is tragic in and of itself, and especially when you've gotten to know somebody who you can really see the upside and you can envision what they might become if they could just overcome these demons. And once that battle has been lost for good, it's really, it's very consuming. It's very painful to participate in somebody's life that way and just have it not work out. And ultimately nowadays, in the era of the opioid epidemic, the stakes are at the highest because people just die. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot.
Yep, it's really sad. I can think of friends of mine who have lost their children. I don't know how they get through that. I don't know how you come back. I mean, I talk a lot about resiliency and all kinds of ways to think positively and improve yourself and do things, but there are some things that are really very, very difficult to stop haunting you all the time. And that's one of the things that I can imagine is at the top of the list.
Well, for whatever reason, that's actually the corner of the world I'm in right now. I specialize in grief and loss and trauma, and a lot of the folks that I'm working with are family members who have lost loved ones to addiction. For whatever reason, my experience working in treatment and the different things I did, it just morphed into that. I think you kind of grow where you're planted and you just find that's what happens to a lot of us that have had the privilege of working in South Florida addiction recovery, is that you find your way into the many different niches that exist within the population. And hopefully if you have a gift for something, that becomes what you specialize in.
Right.
Because substance use disorders span the gamut of all pathology, right? It's comorbid with everything. So substance use disorders are comorbid with health problems. They're comorbid with every other mental health issue. All the mood disorders, all the psychotic disorders, all of the thought disorders, all the, how many people do you know, have you heard of or know that are eating disordered and have a substance use disorder, or are depressed and have a substance use disorder, or are bipolar and have a substance use disorder, or have a history of trauma and a substance use disorder? So it's comorbid with so many different things that you could specialize within the population. And that's pretty much what happened to me. And that's kind of was the movement towards private practice, to really work with these populations amongst other folks.
So most of the people you work with in the context of grief.
Not most. It's 50-50. It's 50 like grief and trauma, and then 50% a bunch of other things. I also specialize in anger management, which is totally different. And I work with a lot of couples. I mean, I'm versatile. Like, I do a lot of different things. Mm-hmm. But that's the grief, the trauma, the EMDR therapy, which that could be a whole episode itself. And if you want to get somebody to do that, get Brian Gong in here. That's the guy to talk about that. But I'm a EMDR therapist as well.
Very good. Very good. So talk a little bit about, before we started taping today, you talked a little bit about prolonged grief disorder.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about what that is, and maybe some of our listeners will connect with the topic a little bit.
Thank you. Yeah. So it's a newer diagnosis, and there was a group of people advocating for its inclusion into the most recent edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, because they believed that it was important. It's a layer of suffering that existed that was somewhat ignored, I think, in our culture, which is that there are forms of grief that are differentiated from what would be, quote, the normal range of experiences. And so prolonged grief, in the trajectory of the grieving process, there is a sort of pathway or a range of experiences within a pathway that would be considered normal, right? And you start off in this acute phase of grief, and eventually it abates into this integrated phase of grief where you have resumed your regular activities. It doesn't mean that the sting of the loss is any less. Losing a loved one is really a profound, lifelong, impacting, life-changing experience. But the acute level of distress of having a recent loss or a traumatic loss, it's different than when you've integrated that experience into your life and you have moved through some of the grieving process, and you're back at work and you're socializing again, and you're doing a lot of the things that you were doing before you lost the person.
And you probably run into people. I know I can think of people in my family that couldn't let go, couldn't just go on. Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, that would probably be someone who would at least get a look for the prolonged grief disorder, because there are people who just stay in that acute phase for years. And to be with them, to talk to them, to look at the way their lives are, it's like the person that they lost, like it's a fresh loss, like they just lost the person. And they talk about them in a way where you might, if you were unfamiliar with the circumstances, you might think that they were talking about someone who passed away like a month ago.
So what do you do for somebody like this in terms of treatment? Somebody who, just can't let go of the acute phase.
It's a lot of work. So there are many facets to it. I think the most important piece about grief is helping the client or the bereaved individual reconceptualize their relationship with the individual who has passed. So my way of thinking about it is this: when somebody dies, when someone that is important to us dies, the relationship with that individual does not end. They're still with us. They're just with us in a different way, in a way that is more challenging to keep them with us. And so we have to figure out what we want that relationship to be. How do I continue to keep you in my life in an important way, even though materially and physically you are no longer here? And that's the goal. And there are certain things that interfere with our ability to do that.
So when somebody, I can think of one of our guests, Rich Pagano's lost his son, Nick. He created, along with Release Recovery, the Nick Pagano Fund. It's very successful. They raise a lot of money to help LGBTQ people that are need substance use disorder treatment, and they help other people get help. Nick had an accidental overdose a couple of summers ago, and Rich and his wife do wonderful work to try to raise money to help people. Is that one of the ways you keep your relationship?
Yeah. So the way I would interpret that, that's called advocacy. And that's that whole concept of taking pain and transitioning into purpose. And I think that that's wonderful when people can do it. And becoming an advocate and bringing awareness and reminding people that your son was somebody, right? That he was an important part of your family, and that he was a person who was lost to an illness, and being able to utilize this tragedy in a way that helps other people. I don't think there's any more profound way of dealing with this than advocacy, but not everybody can do that.
Right. Yeah, it's a special person that can take on that responsibility and devote the time, attention, energy that it takes to do that. But it is, I guess it's a way to keep the person alive.
Absolutely. An incredible way.
And do you deal with suicide and those issues?
Yes. Individuals who have lost family members to suicide. So I'll say this about that. I actually put family members grieving from suicide and family members who have lost individuals to drug overdose in a similar classification. To me, I pair them, I put them together in a way. And that's what we call disenfranchised grief, because there's an element of that is actually qualitatively different than other losses. And those things that make suicide deaths and overdose deaths qualitatively different than other deaths actually complicate the grieving process for those people.
How so?
In a lot of different ways. So the first of which is stigma. Stigma surrounding suicide, stigma surrounding overdose deaths. When you think about it, we live in what I consider to be a death-denying culture. We are very uncomfortable talking about death and loss. Even under the most normal of circumstances, we think about it like this. From the time that you're born, you're assimilated and educated about lots of different things. You're prepared to participate in society through a process that we call socialization. By the time you're 7 years old, hopefully, you're working with the fork and you're good at that. You know your own address. You can write your name. You can write your name in cursive. You are learning math. You're learning how to tell time. But at what point does anybody teach us about death? Like, whose job is that? Who's going to come along and say, hey, you know what? At some point, we are all like the McRib, here for a limited time only, right?
When my son was 4, and my aunt, with whom I had a very close relationship, she was my favorite person that I've ever met, even to this day, on the earth, died. And my son had a close relationship with his aunt, and I was beside myself as to how I was going to tell my son that his aunt died. And I didn't know how to do it. And I went to a child therapist with my wife and sat down, and she taught me how to talk to him. And what she said is, what you tell the child is, sometimes when you get old, you get sick. And sometimes when you get sick, you die. But mommy and daddy are not old, and we're not sick, and we're not dying. And about 10 seconds after I told him that his aunt died, he went off and played with something. It was a non-event. But I was going to fall apart had I not had that conversation with the therapist as to how the hell you do this.
So let me comment on what you had expressed.
Right.
We are never informed about death as a construct until we actually experience it. And that was what was different about your situation, was you had to educate because there was a loss. And now there's a responsibility to explain to him what is going on. And what was great about the advice that was given to you by the therapist was that it normalized the experience for the child to where he understood that this thing that I can't really wrap my mind around yet at this young age, that it's actually normal. And I can realize that people die, but I don't have to worry about it. And that's someone who will have a more healthy relationship with that idea, having had that exposure early on. But the reason he had that exposure was because it actually happened. Most of us bypass that because I think as a society, no one takes that responsibility. Parents don't want to take that on. They don't really train that in schools. I just don't know who in our society is responsible. It's more of an observation than a criticism. I just don't think there's anyone in our society that has the responsibility of teaching young people about mortality.
Yeah, and I think when it happens, unless you get equipped to deal with it, the person themselves often is not equipped to deal with. So how the hell can they teach somebody about it?
Absolutely. Well, it's the avoidance, right? We're a death-denying culture. We want to act like we're going to be here forever.
There's a song called "Flowers Never Bend in the Rainfall" by Simon and Garfunkel. It's a really good song, but it's about somebody who continues to believe my life will never end and flowers never bend in the rainfall, which is to say that I'm going to just ignore it and hope it goes away. And it doesn't go away. We have to live with life and we have to live with death.
We do.
Yeah.
It is part of the human experience.
So suicide is in a different, and also unintentional death through drug overdose with the fentanyl epidemic that's going on with all over the country, all over the world. So you consider that to be in a different place.
The experience of the loved ones is different. And there's a stigma attached to it. So if we think about that, even kind of more typical ways of dying in an accident or dying through old age or dying from sickness, even in those circumstances, most people are at a loss of how to talk about this, right? So take it further, and now there's something that is qualitatively different. Well, now we're really at a loss. What do we say to someone who just lost someone to suicide, or we lost somebody to drug overdose? And I think a lot of times those family members, they feel that judgment and they feel that stigma. And it's real, like the perceptions of society, like the perceptions of the mainstream of society about that are different. I think it's probably improved, but there's a lot of judgment associated with that. So the idea of disenfranchised grief is when we have an experience that our grief, or that we are less entitled to grieve or less entitled to the experience of loss because the quality of the loss is somehow different. So if society judges your son at having been a substance abuser and he dies of a drug overdose, and I don't want to say you're like that, I don't like anybody's son, right, as dying from a drug overdose, and we view that as qualitatively different than if he died in a plane crash, then you're kind of, what's being withheld from the family is the social supports that are actually necessary to move through the grief process, because you can feel that people are judging you and judging your son. And maybe they're thinking, you're not going to get the same support. It's not going to be viewed as a tragedy. It's going to be viewed as something else.
Is there a piece of it that also the person who is the related party somehow has some contributory negligence?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for bringing that up. That is also part of the disenfranchised piece, is the sense of judgment that the parents of people who are lost to suicide, or the parents of people who are lost to drug overdose, maybe they weren't such good parents, because if they were looking
Or a
out
good
for
spouse or whatever.
That is another entire element of that. So they refer to this concept in a lot of the research literature, but they didn't really give it a name. I've taken it upon myself to give it one. And what I call it, it's the self-inflicted death fallacy. And the idea is that suicide deaths and drug overdose deaths are viewed as qualitatively different than other deaths, because there is an action required by the deceased person to facilitate their own demise. They have to do something. They have to inject fentanyl, or they have to participate. They have to complete a suicide act. We don't say commit suicide. We say complete suicide. You know why we don't? That's a stigmatizing term. So the idea of saying we commit suicide, the word commit is associated with criminal behavior, like, so committing suicide, committing manslaughter, committing murder. We don't want to say that, because suicide deaths, it's not about criminal behavior. It's about mental health. So it's more appropriate to say that someone dies by suicide rather than saying that they commit suicide. Just a little point.
Mm-hmm. Has anybody else heard this?
Yeah.
Because they still use this expression.
So in terms of the people who are advocating for taking stigma out of suicide and drug overdose deaths, yes, they're advising and trying to change the language and advocating for removal of stigma. And part of it is the way that we talk about it. Right. So that's,
I think it doesn't change the outcome, but it's a better way to think of it for those of us who survive.
Well, think about it like this, right? Committing suicide, that kind of feeds into this idea of self-inflicted death fallacy, because he committed something, he did something, as opposed to saying they died by suicide. Well, that's the way we talk. Like, you died by a heart attack, you died from, a stroke, you died from an automobile accident. Mm-hmm. It's a more appropriate way to say it. Right. A guy by the name of Irving Yalom wrote a book about death anxiety. It's called Staring at the Sun. And he calls it Staring at the Sun because conversations in our culture about death are like staring at the sun. You won't look at it for too long because it's uncomfortable. And one of the things he says about death anxiety is that death anxiety is proportionally related to your experience of unmet potential. Meaning that if I feel as though I have lived an unfulfilled life and not done the things that I was meant to do or could do or had the potential to do, then I am more likely to be fearful of death, because it feels like my opportunities are gone. And there's a grieving of the loss of dreams or the loss of potential. It just never happened for me. So that's why Bruce Springsteen's cool with being 69 years old, because that's a guy who clearly fulfilled his potential. I mean, what else is there left for him to do, So I think coming from him, it means something, because it speaks to that question of, I fulfilled my purpose. I met my potential. I fulfilled myself in life. So as he gets older, there's probably less of a sense of regret than somebody else who really struggled with the loss of dreams and certain ambitions and things that just didn't come together for them in their lifetime.
So is somebody who is not afraid, nobody is looking forward to the way they're going to die, because it could be something that's painful, prolonged, or whatever. And nobody who's talking knows what it's like to go through that process. It's just, by definition, you hear about people who went to the other side and came back. But I guess, is there any kind of dysfunction about somebody who really isn't concerned about that? Or is it somebody who's peculiarly or particularly balanced? 'Cause I'm just thinking that someone who's, I mean, I can think of people who might be extremely religious, perhaps, or people who are completely fulfilled in their life. But is there any kind of dysfunction in not having that concern?
So I would say it like this. Anything I'm saying from this point forward in response to this, purely speculative, right? So it's just more opinion and experience based and based in anecdote. But it is a compelling question. And I would say that people who have strong spiritual alignment with a religion and like a clear belief about an afterlife or a purpose or souls and fulfilling purpose or, you know, an eternity in heaven, they're going to have a greater comfort level with the idea of their own mortality because they see the lifespan as being less important than how you spend eternity. So I don't think that's pathological. I think that that is a healthy way for a certain segment of people to embrace that experience. However, we are not all religious and we don't all subscribe to these ideas of an afterlife. And that's where things get a little more complicated because you got to kind of figure out what it all means on your own. And when you think about people who are unafraid to die, I think that that's positive in a way until it's not, because that also is, well, in what context are you saying that? Are you treating your life like it's worthless? Are you neglectful of your own health? Are you a guy who eats like crap and smokes cigarettes and, you know, doesn't visit the doctor and doesn't take care of it? And they go, I don't really care. You know, when my time's up, my time's up. You know, that I think is very unhealthy.
It's a good point. There are different ways to look at that approach. But somebody who's taking care of themselves and respects themselves, respects their life, who is not overly consumed.
Well, I think there's an existential dilemma, right? And it's one of the existential tenets that we have to live knowing that at some point we're going to die. And so you have to kind of make sense of that on a day-to-day basis, because if I'm constantly consumed with the idea that at some point I'm going to die, then I will become an extremely neurotic individual who's constantly seeing threats where there might not be any. And now I'm not living my life. I'm just trying not to die. And that's a terrible existence itself. And I think that that results in a lot of neurotic behavior and health phobias. And
you know, I'm smiling because I'm thinking of my Uncle Irwin, who did a genealogy tree of the entire family going back as far as he possibly could. And he went back far and he made a copy of this genealogy tree. Now, what did the genealogy tree say? It told you what each person died from. And he was constantly at doctors, as was his wife, and lived his life to prevent himself from dying. And that's exactly what you're just talking about.
Yeah.
And we laugh about it. We're kind of glad we know who our relatives were, but we laugh about the fact that we know that, you know, one person died during a cataract surgery or something like that, or, you know, he was preoccupied with death his whole life.
Yeah, that sounds like something that bordered obsession. And meanwhile, while you're running around worrying about all these different things, are you living your life? Are you, you know, having meaningful experiences? Because we're not here forever. We know that. And so what's the answer? Well, I think the answer is to live a life worth living, you know, a life of quality. And however you define that, through relationships or accomplishments or pursuits or, you know, whatever it is that you appreciate the most, I think that's the answer, to live your life while you can.
Now, I remember when we talked last time, I had mentioned that I had read in school, or at some point during psychology classes, that they were pushing these stages of grief.
Right.
And you had told me that you thought that the stages of grief are either not something that's really the current thinking, or that it's a lot of malarkey.
So it comes from the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who created these stages of grief out of her research. Here's the thing about that. The research that she did, and this is back in the 60s when she published her book on death and dying, which is what popularized these phases of grief. Here's the thing about that. Her research was normed on people who were dying of terminal illness. So that's who she was interviewing, people who were dying, who knew that they were dying and were trying to make peace of the fact that they were suffering a terminal illness. And that's what she based her whole research on. My contention about utilizing these phases of grief to describe all grief is the experience of losing a loved one, is the experience of losing your aunt, or is your sister that passed?
No, it was, well, the aunt is,
your aunt.
It was his great aunt.
The great aunt, gotcha. The experience of losing your great aunt is not this. Is that the same thing as a person who is dying from a terminal illness and is aware of that? I think they're two different experiences. So the phases of grief that are being applied to the person who's dying of a terminal illness, I don't know that necessarily applies to the experience of someone who's lost a loved one. And what's really interesting about that is that this idea of the phases of grief has persisted since the book was written in the late 60s. So it's still kind of an ideology that even among mental health and behavioral health professionals is still prolific. It's still something that we're promoting and saying. The people who are really kind of on the cutting edge of the most modern research related to grief and loss, they're in New York, and that is the Columbia University School of Psychiatry Institute for Prolonged Grief. The founder of the institute is a woman by the name of Catherine Shear, and she is the one who really did all of the research. And a lot of the things that I'm talking about here today, those are ideas that I got from her, reading her work and watching YouTube videos of lectures and things like that, that reconceptualized my idea of what the grieving experience is. She's also one of the people who advocated for the addition of the prolonged grief disorder into the latest edition of the DSM-5. So that's important. That's a massive contribution to our understanding of this phenomenon. And also at NYU, they did more research on grief, and they did these grief trajectory models where they sort of normed what typical grief experiences are for like the general public, and they fall into like 4 categories. So there are people in the last 20 years who are bringing our understanding of this phenomenon further along than what we had. But what's interesting about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and the phases of grief is, to me, we're talking about something that from the late 60s. So we essentially spent the last 50 years or so using this information that was normed on the wrong population of people. And that's not any discredit to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. Her contributions to this is the woman who created an interest in this country in like near-death experiences. When you talk about people seeing the white light, she was the one who did all the research on that got people talking about that. She was the first person to really study that at an academic level. And she is also largely responsible for like the hospice movement in this country. She was kind of at the forefront of that and bringing that forward as a humane way to deal with terminal illness. So this woman's contributions to death and dying are really beyond measure. So it's not to take any credit away from her. It's really more of what society did with her material and how we sort of misused it to describe a phenomenon that it really wasn't meant to describe, in my opinion.
It's lived on quite a bit for something about death and grief, it has quite a life.
Right. So my whole philosophy on that, when we talk about death denying culture, in the late 60s, we got these 5 phases of grief that describes this phenomenon that no one really wants to talk about. Great. That's it. 5 phases. Easy to understand. We're just going to go ahead and go with this.
Go have a McRib.
Yeah, we're just going to go ahead and we'll go with this. We've got these 5 phases. It works. It's easy to describe. And oh, you lost somebody? Yeah, that's the 5 phases you're in. You're in shock now. You're in denial. You're in anger. And that's as much as we need to know.
So I'm curious. I know we've been talking a lot about death and grief.
Sure.
Any thoughts you have on the best way for somebody? And a lot of people that are watching our podcast are in recovery or seeking recovery. Let's talk a little bit about living. Any good thoughts you have on how to live your best life, and just get the most out of your life while we're all here?
I think my suggestions about that are really kind of simple and really very much aligned with the recovering ideologies, like what people in AA talk about, right? So the first thing is, you don't want to get caught up in bullshit. Like, you don't want to be a person who gets caught up in a lot of petty grievances and resentments. And you definitely don't want to be dealing with that in your relationships. That, I think, is a recipe for a lot of unhappiness. I think comparing ourselves to others, I think being jealous of people, I think things that are overly focused outside of ourselves in negative ways, I think that's just like a recipe for unhappiness and bitterness. Anything that like separates you from people or isolates you from people is probably bad. Because we're social animals and we were meant to be connected and we're meant to be feeling part of things. So I think that stuff is really important. I think it's gratitude, I think, is very important. To be appreciative of what you have, the opportunities that you have, to live in appreciation of them. I think I'm a big fan of the abundant mindset, when seeing the world as having and delivering, like everything I want and need is available to me. I don't have to be afraid. I don't have to be worried. Oh, I'm not going to get my opportunities. I'm not going to find love, or I'm not going to have enough of this or that. I think that creates a smaller and more fearful life. So I think being grateful, I think being clear about what's important, being clear about what's important in terms of relationships and not getting caught up in these petty smallnesses is really an important thing.
I don't remember who said it to me, but it was a long time ago. When you compare yourself to somebody else, you're comparing your insides with somebody else's outsides. And usually you think you're better than somebody, or you're not as good as them. You think you're better than them, you're kind of a dick. And if you don't think you're as good as somebody else, you feel bad about yourself. Both are losing approaches, losing efforts, losing things to pay attention to. Best thing to do is to compare yourself to yourself. How was I doing, yesterday? How am I doing today? And I often, when I talk to people that are going into treatment, and I say, how did you feel when you walked in? How do you feel now? They always say, oh, I feel a lot better. Well, that's that's a fair comparison, because you're comparing, your insides to your insides. Just how are you doing? Check in with yourself, and everybody else's comparisons they don't matter.
Yeah. There are these like measuring sticks where I think we should check in with ourselves. I think it's important to be self-aware, because that allows you to recognize when there's work to be done. And it also allows you to recognize when we're improving and getting better. So for myself, we were talking yesterday. I attended the Sierra Tucson gratitude breakfast yesterday. And this was this lovely event with hundreds of people in our field, people working in treatment, people who are interventionists and psychotherapists and treatment executives. And they were all there, a few hundred people.
Good meal?
Yeah, great meal. And at Boca Raton Resort, they really did it up nice. And so I'm there and I'm watching people be awarded and having, really nice, being celebrated really for their achievements and their accomplishments, and getting awards and making speeches and getting a lot of positive attention. And I think there was a time earlier in my life, in my career, where that would have made me extremely jealous. I would have been looking at them like, I wins my opportunity, and I would have been I'm like a baby. Where's my, what am I? How come I'm not up there? I could do things, And
I could have been a contender.
Yeah. Well, I always think about like the Godfather.
Yeah.
So in The Godfather 2, where Fredo when Michael is confronting Fredo about like basically betraying his family,
With Mo Green.
Yeah, the Mo Green thing. And he just freaks out and he's like, what about me? What about my opportunities? I could have been somebody, and all that. But when I think about that, there was a time when I would have been that person that was looking at everyone else and like, I should be doing this, or why am I not having those opportunities? And when I was there yesterday, I was watching those people with complete admiration and appreciation for what they had done. I really was like feeling that I was celebrating them. I was excited to see them get awards. I was excited to be there. I was just grateful to be part of it because my invitation to that was last minute. I was glad that I was there. I was grateful to be there. I was excited for these people in a genuine way because, a few of them are people that I knew that really I do respect and that have done wonderful things. So watching those people get awards, I was just happy for them. And I really was able to experience it in a genuine and grateful way, just to be there and to celebrate them. And I'm like, you know what? That's better. That's definitely better than whatever petty thing that I was on some years ago before I got to this place. And I'm thinking, okay, well, what's different about me if that's how I'm viewing this? And I think it's because I have appreciation for my own place in the world, my own success. And I don't need to compare it to somebody else who's more successful or less successful. I'm not in competition with anybody. I think it was Ernest Hemingway who said, the only person you should ever compete with is your former self. And I think that's just a better recipe for a happier person than being involved in pettiness and comparisons and competing with everyone for everything.
You also used an expression before we started taping. You said, I think, faster alone, further together.
Yes.
It kind of reminds me, what you're saying reminds me of the fact that you're part of a community of people who are helping other people. And there's nobody making a scorecard as to who's helped more people or anything like that. You're all working cooperatively with the community of people who need help. And
I think too, like the podcast I do where I'm interviewing a lot of people, that's part of that, because I'm really featuring and highlighting their work. I might talk a little bit about some of the stuff that I'm doing, but really the focus is on the other person. And I'm comfortable doing that. I don't worry about where's my promotional opportunity here. I'm doing all this work and editing and taking all this time. I kind of like don't care about that as much. I know that if I just keep doing a good job at what I do, the clients will be there, the success will be there. It's more of that abundant mindset of just believing in what you're doing, and that if you do it well, you don't really have to worry about those things. And then you can take more time to appreciate other people.
What's the name of your podcast?
That is Good Counsel, the Helping People's Podcast, available at Apple, Spotify, and at my website, ericbrickerlmhc.com.
Very well done.
Thank you.
So I had the opportunity to listen to I think the most recent drop of your podcast on Apple, and I thought you were inspiring and fascinating, and your guest was wonderful, Tanya Brown. Could you tell us a little bit about Tanya?
So Tanya Brown is the youngest sister of Nicole Brown Simpson, who was victim of the most publicized violent crime in American history. the fascination with her sister's murder captured all of the nation's attention to this day. Like, it's 30 years later and people are still talking about it, speculating about it. At the time, it was, a national obsession. There was the Dream Team and, the stuff that went on in the courtroom, and just,
For the people that don't know, because there are some people that are watching the podcast that don't know what we're talking about. It was about 1994.
right.
And O.J. Simpson was a famous football player.
Yeah.
He became an actor.
Yes.
And he was married to Nicole Brown Simpson.
Yes.
And was on trial for murder.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And the trial, the Dream Team you referred to was Shapiro and Cochran, Johnny Cochran.
Yes.
And then Marsha Clark and Darden were the prosecutors. And everybody knew who the prosecutors were. Everybody knew who the folks that were defending Simpson. And the murder trial was whether or not O.J. Simpson murdered Ron Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson, right?
Yes.
And in preparation for our interview, I watched the new movie that's out, so I would remember what I lived through. But a lot of people didn't live through it.
It's interesting that you're even saying all that, because when I interviewed her and we jumped right in, I didn't give a lot of context to it. I mentioned what I mentioned about the publicized nature of the murder, but it's almost it's so publicized. It's such a historically relevant event. I almost operate under the assumption that everybody just knows this, but it's good that you fill in all the color there, the context rather.
Well, I know that there are a lot of people, that's a long time ago already.
It is.
It's 30 years.
I was saying, even my son, who's 22 years old, so he was born 8 years after all of this, from social media and the internet, he is aware. He's fully aware of this. He knows who O.J. Simpson was, knows about the murder, knows about the white Bronco, which was the famous car chase before he was brought in, when he became an actual suspect, O.J. Simpson.
Right.
So Tanya, her story is really not about the sensationalism and our national fascination with this murder. It's really more about the impact all of this had on her and her family. So at the center of all of this mayhem, this media circus and tabloids and all the rest of it, there's a real family. Real people who are reeling with grief and trauma over this tragic death, the murder of a beloved sister. And it was handled with such insensitivity on the part of the media and just people in general who were, walking around with free OJ t-shirts, and, they were making money off of this. They were making money off this stuff. It was like somebody's tragedy. And these are good people. These are a close family, just regular people. They lived on the beach. They were just kind of regular, normal folks. And this thing happened, and they got thrown into this media circus. And I think Tanya's story is one of delayed grief, because her and her family never really had an opportunity to properly grieve this loss, because everywhere you go, you have to act this way when we're in the courtroom. Don't say this to this person. We have to kind of be cloistered from the media and people. So they picked one of the sisters to be the spokesperson, and she, as the youngest sibling, was really kept from a lot of stuff. And ultimately, the impact of all of this over time really had, it wore her down. And she had the delayed onset grief, the depression, the anxiety. And so this is really her story. She wrote a book about her mental health journey called Finding Peace Among the Chaos, which is really her whole mental health journey through a suicide attempt, being psychiatrically hospitalized, getting through that stuff, going into her own recovery process from depression. And she, is an advocate now for mental health recovery, and really just like a very open and honest person, an open book. So she was a phenomenal interview and like a cool person to talk to. And while we were talking about this, it takes you back to this experience, and it gives you another totally different look at it from inside the house as opposed to outside the house. And when I say the house, I'm talking about the home where Tanya's parents and sisters and where Tanya was living at the time. That was constantly surrounded by media and news and helicopters and, you know, all of these different people that were intruding on their privacy during this tragedy.
In your conversations with Tanya, did, Ron Goldman's father was very prominent in speaking and also in suing O.J. Simpson civilly and winning a large civil lawsuit for wrongful death. Was the Brown family and the Goldman family in regular contact with each other, or did that not come up?
You know, we didn't really talk about it, and honestly, that's probably my bad. I didn't think to ask about it so much. There's so many different things that we could have talked about, and I really wanted to keep on the target, which was her and her story. Mm-hmm. And in the book, when I was reading it in preparation, she had mentioned, like, hey, people who are looking for juicy details, all of that, this isn't going to be one of those. This is really about my mental health journey. So
I was wondering whether they comforted each other because they both were going through the same thing at the same time.
I'm sure. And that's actually a really good question. And I wished I would have thought to ask it. I was just trying to stay on track with her story, her mental health journey, her being hospitalized, and then ultimately she was very generous with her time. She came over here from the West Coast and, you know, stayed overnight and spent like a couple of hours with me. Nice. It's like 2 hours worth of interview I got. So, but I don't really know so much about that relationship, but more so just what she experienced personally and like what she has overcome to this point.
Right. Well, she sounds like a very, very together young lady and somebody who I'd love to speak to.
Yeah, she's really likable. And when she tells you the family that she comes from, it's very believable because she's so personable in that way. And you could just see that these were probably, you know, these parents, these World War II era parents and the 4 daughters. And they were just like a fun, friendly family at the beach where all the kids would come and hang out. And they were just like, they sound like lovely people, honestly. It just makes it all that much more sad, the whole story.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you did a great job interviewing her. I can't wait for the second one to drop. It'll drop when?
I think probably this coming Wednesday. I'm going to put it out.
When this airs, it will already have dropped. So go listen to, it's on Apple Podcasts.
Yes.
To Eric's podcast. And I'm sure you're going to do other episodes with other interesting people as well.
Yeah, I've got people coming up. They're more like local folks, but, you know, they're celebrities in our little bubble.
Well, same with us. We don't always have people like you here. We have regular people. And, you know, it's always good. So one of the things that I get to do when Irene and I do Crosstalk is we get to meet so many different people. The journey of doing this is intended to inform everybody that's listening on things that they might not be aware of, stories, recovery stories, or just really smart people telling things like we did today. But I learned so much, and I'm so grateful for your being here with us today on Crosstalk. And I know that we're going to get a lot of play out of reels that we're going to do with you because the nuggets of wisdom just kept coming and coming and coming. And I really enjoyed having the time together.
Oh, thank you so much. You know, I really appreciate the opportunity. And like I said, I love what you guys are doing. You guys are really like good people. So it makes all of this easier. Like I came in here and I think I felt loose from the start because I felt like I'm just comfortable with people that I knew. So it just makes it all easier that I'm not like that. I didn't feel like at any point there was anything to worry about, you know? Right.
Well, we just want to sit and talk. And the great part about this is that we're both, doing this for, this is not Crosstalk actually is a 501c3. Crosstalk Official Foundation. Ultimately, we're going to hopefully get all our subscribers to know about that and maybe help us bring more content, and because it's not that easy doing this and being regular and all that stuff. But we're just in our infancy, doing some stuff that we really like, and we hope everybody who's listening will subscribe and like and ring the bell, and that's how we know you're listening. Eric, thanks so much for being here today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you all.